I would like to speak today about side-sitting position. A side-sitting position is a very basic, functional, useful position in the Feldenkrais method. We have quite a few lessons that have side-sitting position built into them, or that use side-sitting as a basic format for the lesson. And it's also just simply a very useful position, especially for those of you who are interested in getting more down into the floor, who want to feel more comfortable transitioning from the floor to standing and back down to the floor. It's even a position that you find yourself in while you transition. So when you lie down and come to sit and stand, oftentimes you find yourself briefly in a side-sitting position in the transition. And when I need to spend a lot of time on the floor, I always go to the side-sitting position because it's one of the most comfortable and dynamic places I can be in, because I can go in and out of it and change a lot as I'm there. So I would like to introduce the concept in a sort of a Feldenkrais way of thinking, and maybe in a future date come back to it and do a little more, maybe more advanced stuff. But for starters, let's look at this. This is, there's a very wide base of support under you. You're sitting a little bit to the side of your sitz bone, right? So it's not like sitting square to the front. It's a little bit more to the side. So there's definitely a little bit of a leaning on the thigh bone, or somewhere in between the thigh bone and the pelvis in the area of the hip joint, right? And very often, and for most people, side-sitting, you need to lean on your hand, right? So there are people who are so flexible that when they side-sit, both sits bone reach the floor. But for most people, one sits bone or one side of the pelvis is on the floor and the other one is off the floor, right? Depending on who you are and how you've been moving and functioning, you may need to lean further away, you may need to lean further forward or backwards. You may feel that this is too taxing for you at the beginning, in which case you can use blocks, bigger or smaller blocks under you, and that little change can be very, very significant. It can really make side-sitting a lot easier and will allow you to get there if you're daunted by how tough it is at the beginning. So please play with it if you're interested in getting there. I brought a blanket here next to me because for some people these blocks are a little bit too intense, in which case you just put the blanket under yourself, and legs are lower on the floor. That little change, 1 inch or even less than that, can make a very big difference. Okay, so this is it. Now, when you look at side position and begin to break it down a little bit, to deconstruct it a little bit and see what the elements that build it are, people do it in right? People are structured and in a very unique way. Some people, the classic way is to put one leg behind, right, and bring the other foot in to sort of put it snug against the other thigh below the knee. Some people, you find a lot of variations on the theme. There are people who go a little bit more under, especially at the beginning before they're used to this position, until they're able to separate them more. Some people like to have the foot here, or so little variations. Just find your own comfort within this. The knees, right? So we can look at the knees on ways of moving in the side-sitting position, in the world of side-sitting. And if I lean a little bit back and I begin to lift the knee, that's interesting. That really is a movement that comes from my pelvis, if you notice, right? And as I do this, I'm noticing that this one is beginning to lift as well, right? And then I can do that and just sort of lift that knee, or I can shift back a little, rotate myself a little bit further back, bring the other hand back, and bring both knees up, right? And that could be a process, that could be a lesson by itself, to just do that, and after a while, once you're comfortable and ready to do more, you may be able to do that, right? And then you begin to see that there's much more to side-sitting than simply side-sitting, because, when I sit on the floor for a long time and listen to someone talking or spend time with a toddler, I oftentimes am side-sitting, changing. I can change the legs, right? And I can change myself. I can rotate my whole self and keep the feet where they were, right? I can lean further on my forearm to make it easier. If this is too taxing, this might be a nice solution, etc., etc. If you want to lean on your forearm but you feel that it's too far to the back, you can do this. You can side sit, leaning on a little something that you create, and you're not leaning that far down. You're leaning a little bit higher and higher, and eventually you come to sit this way. If you notice, one of the major elements in the posture of side sitting is a side bending, right? It sort of calls for side bending, right? And if it's a concept that is foreign to you, you can begin to, again, investigate and play with it. If you notice, because this sits bone is lifted, automatically I'm side bent this way, right? There's like a little bit of a C shape to my spine. And that, once again, invites side bending, more side bending, less side bending, no side bending, etc., etc. So we're talking about knees, we're talking about the pelvis, the side bending element of it, and then there is the torso. And the torso immediately includes the spine, and this is really interesting because Moshe Feldenkrais developed many, many, many lessons on side bending that have to do with twisting. And the reason why side bending is such a wonderful way to work with twisting is because your pelvis is kind of stationary, right? If you stand and twist and turn, right, your pelvis goes with it. But if you're sitting, this is where you start the twist. So it allows you to really address the spine and look at how it's twisting, right? So if I look at one of the classic lessons, which is letting the wrist hang in front of the face and beginning to turn and turn and turn, you see there is definitely movement in my pelvis as I do this, but the twisting happens because the pelvis stays there, and my upper body and my head and face and eyes can rotate all the way and twist my spine. There are even lessons that go what seems counterintuitive to the other direction. And of course, once you really do the lesson, once you get into the details, you realize that you need to, when you spiral that way, it's really nice to have this lengthening while you spiral, which really sort of not only protects the spine, but really make this a lot more comfortable and efficient. I think that's really enough for you to begin to play with, to begin to maybe rethink this whole side-sitting business, and maybe invite yourself to play with it a little bit more, especially when you're sitting on the floor. And again, it doesn't have to be for long periods of time. You can do this for a minute at a time, play with it a little bit, leave it alone, and go back to your usual way of sitting. But just remember, a very, very safe, simple, comfortable way of moving on the floor. And if you spend not too much time, if you invest a little bit of time into becoming more and more familiar with it, it will become yours, and it will show up in your life later on, not only in sitting on the floor, but in other ways, in other functional ways. Hope this helps. Please play with it, and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.